Today we're going to be talking about humor in films. We're going to be looking at two films whose use of various types of humor plays a crucial role to portraying and advancing each respective film's message. The first is war comedy Jojo Rabbit, directed by Taika Waititi. The second is comedy satire The Great Dictator, directed by Charlie Chaplin. Jojo Rabbit is a story about a boy who desperately wants to find community. In the midst of World War II and the propaganda campaign of Nazi youth, he declares himself a Nazi fanatic and goes to a Nazi youth summer camp. When a grenade goes awry, injuring him, he finds himself more isolated than ever. He still tries to find an identity by doing everything he can to help Germany and Hitler, like collecting metal in a robot suit. The film has themes of Nazism, propaganda, pleasure, bravery, friendship, and love, and sacrifice, and childhood. For The Great Dictator, in the First World War, a Jewish barber is injured and ends up spending years in an army hospital recovering. During this time, he is completely unaware of the rise of a fascist dictator. When he finally returns to his hometown, he learns of Heinkel and his anti-Semitic policies and ends up joining a rebellion, which eventually lands him in a concentration camp. He eventually escapes and poses as Heinkel, who looks nearly identical, and ends up denouncing everything Heinkel stands for in a rousing and iconic speech. The film has themes of Nazism, friendship, bravery, and kindness. Both films implement strong tactics of humor that not only greatly entertain the audience, but also help prove each film as impactful, important, innovative, and successful in my opinion. The most effective types of humor used in both films are satirical, hyperbolic, parodic, slapstick, and farcical. Both The Great Dictator and Jojo Rabbit are much more than a parody. They are a stirring denunciation of fascism's core principles: xenophobia, intolerance, bigoted nationalism, and anti-Semitism. They are funny, but the world they exist in is intrinsically violent. For the purpose of this video essay, we will focus on satire. Satire is a humor that mocks human weaknesses, or in this case, aspects of society. In The Great Dictator, the character Adenoid Heinkel is a Hitler spoof by way of short-tempered and preposterously powerful personality, a dictator of the fictional country Tomania. The Great Dictator focuses its satirical efforts on to Hitler and his inhumane ideologies, while Jojo Rabbit's satire is centered around the idea of how ludicrous the Nazi regime and German nationalism itself is at the time, especially when it comes to recruiting impressionable young children. On the cusp of the Second World War in 1938, when the Munich Agreement was being signed in Europe, Chaplin was creating his first draft of The Great Dictator. The movie debuted in New York on October 15, 1940. Chaplin's native country, England, had declared war in September of 1939, but the United States, his place of residency, had remained out of the conflict. In a personal yet public way, Chaplin waged war against Hitler via the screen. The film was banned in Germany until April of 1997, nearly 50 years later. It was a highly political and daring time to make a satire about a dictator who would go on to enact the largest genocide in history.
Hey, help me keep the party alive.
Jojo Rabbit was the result of a long process that spanned nearly a decade. The script was loosely based on a portion of Luann's 2004 novel, Caging Skies, and adapted into a screenplay in which Waititi took some creative liberties in 2011. In 2012, Jojo Rabbit landed on the blacklist of top unproduced screenplays. The film wasn't picked up by Searchlight and filmed until 2018, and was then released in 2019. According to The Hollywood Reporter, Waititi also revealed that he was inspired to make Jojo Rabbit after reading a statistic that 41% of Americans and 66% of American millennials had never heard of Auschwitz. That really struck me because I felt like at the end of the war they said, "We should never let this happen again. We'll never forget." And it's 2019 and kind of feels like we're starting to forget, he said. The filmmaker added that he hoped the movie would continue the conversation and keep memories of those lost in the Holocaust alive. This sentiment echoes the changes, not only in America but globally as well, as a surge of hate groups and neo-Nazis come after Donald Trump comes into American presidency. I also want to note here the monetary consistency audiences have to receiving critique of the history of Nazi Germany in World War II. The Great Dictator made $5 million at the box office during its release, and Jojo Rabbit made $90.3 million. When you correlate the worth of $5 million in 1940 to today, you see that The Great Dictator made $89.4 million. Charlie Chaplin makes his switch from silent to sound with The Great Dictator, and within the film expresses his feelings on this. In the beginning of the movie, Chaplin makes the rants of Heinkel gibberish, almost devoid of content, but as the film progresses, more and more real words can be understood in Chaplin's gibberish. At the end, we hear a speech clear as day in which Chaplin, within the context of the movie and in a more outwardly response, basically says we can't afford to stay silent any longer and takes a definitive stand against any such dogma. Waititi has a consistent style of humor in his films that Jojo Rabbit is no exception to. He expertly balances his political satire within World War II Germany with the current propaganda crisis plaguing America with Trump, all while wrapping it up in a readily accessible coming-of-age movie. For The Great Dictator, integration of various elements of editing, directing, use of music, and cinematography, along with the comedic components to tell this story is perfectly encapsulated by this scene.
Strange. These strike leaders, they're all brunettes. Not a blonde amongst them.
Brunettes are troublemakers. They're worse than the Jews.
Then wipe them out.
Too small. Not so fast. We get rid of the Jews first, then concentrate on the brunettes.
Shall never have peace until we have a pure Aryan race. How wonderful. Tulmania, a nation of blue-eyed blondes.
Why not a blonde Europe, a blonde Asia, a blonde America?
So this whole conversation really is just making fun of the ideologies that Hitler had in a satirical way. Because as you'll see here, you have the Great Dictator himself being highly influenced by his second-in-command and letting him stroke his ego. And then you see, talk about right here,
You make me afraid of myself.
it's all done in a very laughable kind of way.
We'll start with the invasion of Austerlitz. After that, we won't have to fight, we can bluff. Nation after nation will capitulate. Within 2 years, the world will be under your thumb.
Leave me. I want to be alone.
So this next sequence with the globe is very Charlie Chaplin. It really shows his auteurism in this film because you get a little bit of this classic slapstick comedy, and also you get to see a universal comedy again because there's very little talking in it. So this whole sequence also being silent makes it universally acceptable and doesn't put a barrier of language on the content like a little bit of the other parts of the film has, because you're sort of taken out of the film itself when you hear Charlie Chaplin's English accent. It doesn't come across the same way as his silent films did. The whole dance that the dictator is doing with the globe too is also very satirical of his world domination plans. The camera work here is also very interesting because it doesn't necessarily follow the ball or Chaplin himself. It's almost a dreamlike sequence of this daydreaming moment that the dictator is having of world dominance. And he quite literally is having the world in his hands. The music is also very dreamlike as well. For Jojo Rabbit, I would choose this scene.
Jojo Rabbit! Jojo Rabbit! Hunting cats! Jojo Rabbit!
Hey, this is amazing! We're like two human antelopes!
In this section with the music, there's like the beating of a kind of wilderness feeling and running through the jungle. It's very Boyhood-like, and it really helps create this image that the entire movie is in Jojo's perspective. And then the next sequence of events is very satirical with the whole Nazi youth camp.
Now, lads, each of you will be given the opportunity
And then
to
it goes on
ignite
further to make fun of Nazi
throw a
officers as you
grenade.
see that Sam Rockwell's
I will
character
personally
takes
be
a swig from
supervising each
his
of you
flask.
to make sure you don't blow your eyes out or something. All right, who's first? Klaus!
And of course, to point out the obvious, Jojo having a imaginary friend that is Hitler himself is the biggest satire that you could possibly have of Hitler. Also, it's definitely worth noting that Jojo Rabbit is made in color, which is super important because it makes it more modern and more accessible, and it really changes the tone as compared to The Great Dictator, which was made in black and white.
Shit.
Shit!
Don't do that.
Another note on color for Jojo Rabbit is the graduation that the film took in using color as a way to symbolize Jojo's understanding and feeling of the war and all of its atrocities. In the beginning of the film, he is seen in much brighter colors and he sees the world in brighter colors. And by the end of the film, because he understands a lot more that's happening in the war, he sees everything in a much more bleaker kind of note, which was more apparent to how they actually were. The director's approaches to these movies have stark differences. The Great Dictator is a continuation of Charlie Chaplin's auteur films. Chaplin is not only mocking the political state of his day, but he is also having a conversation off-screen about this weird similarity of his origin story that mirrors Hitler's. From growing up in poverty to becoming known around the world, the signature mustache is not the only thing Chaplin and Hitler shared. Waititi, on the other hand, while connected to the history of World War II through his Jewish ancestry, doesn't pursue a personal conversation, but rather a sociological one, in which he mirrors some of today's propaganda with that of a spoof of Nazi Germany's.
Range, 95,452.
Here, when you see Charlie Chaplin pull the trigger, it's a visual gag, because he's going to pull it and then kind of fall, and it's going to be comical. And when the missile hits the outhouse, you're also going to hear a visual and an auditory kind of gag.
Hey, stand by your trigger.
Yes, sir.
Range correction, 95,455. Range, 95,455. Yes, sir.
Next, when he pulls the trigger again and nothing happens and you kind of get this sound, that's going to be an audio gag. And finally, when you see all of the officers telling each other, like, down the line, come here, let's go, check it out, and then you see them actually line up in descending order, that's going to be a parody or a satire of the military. And you can see them kind of just chucking the command down the chain of line.
Yes, check the fuse.
Yes, sir. The fuse.
Now, as he goes to examine the missile, this is going to be a slapstick comedy. It's a little bit more reminiscent of what he's done in his silent films. cool thing that Charlie Chaplin does in this film is find a way to make a satire of the military, which is an extension of the government, while he's both the Jewish barber here in this war zone, and also, of course, while he is playing a spoof of Hitler himself.
What's that? An air raid! Left a big weapon! Quick to the anti-aircraft gun! Here again! Quick!
So in this next clip of Jojo Rabbit, we're also going to see a visual gag because Jojo is dressed up as a robot collecting metal, and then a bit of satire about the military as we see an 11-year-old dressed up to go to war in paper uniform.
You okay? Hey! You're a soldier now? At your service. But you're only 11. I know. May I? Yeah, sure. Is that paper? That's what I thought at first too, but it's paper-like. It's the latest material invented by our top scientists. Well, I'm impressed. Hey, Yorkie. I caught a Jew. A real one. Oh, a Jew. I saw some that they caught hiding in the forest last month. Personally, I didn't see what all the fuss was about. They weren't at all scary and seemed kind of normal. Oh, I'm getting distracted. I got to go. Bye.
In the next clip, we'll see slapstick comedy.
Hard to run in this thing. You okay? Oh, God.
Okay, so to go over what we just said and what we just saw, you can see that with Jojo wearing this big, bright, red robot outfit, he is a visual gag and he really stands out because of the colors in the film. And also you have this character, Yodi, that represents a more matured and sane kind of way of viewing the world that's happening around him, while also using him as a point of laughter and of satire because he is an 11-year-old military man, but is keenly aware of it and how weird that actually is. In the end, these films are message movies. They use humor tools like satire to bring in an audience to a story, get them comfortable, and set them up to hear the message of the story while they are vulnerable and open to hearing it. The Great Dictator sets a precedent in its 2-hour-long journey that culminates in one of the most iconic speeches of all time. Jojo Rabbit brings a satirical look to Nazism so fresh that it shell-shocks the audience into realizing the harsh propaganda of World War II isn't done and away with, but rather is still prevalent in society today. Like Waititi said, the only real way to fight bullies is with humor. Comedy is very, very important against bigotry and hate and intolerance, and we have to continue to use it because it's a great way of disarming bullies and poking through holes in their belief systems. So, to summarize, I want to talk about why satire is an effective form of criticism and how both of these movies expertly use it. Essentially, satire is a rhetoric tool that's specifically designed to make criticism more approachable. The Great Dictator was made right before World War II had started, and it dealt with subject matter that at the time was highly politicized and also very supported. Hitler had successfully convinced an entire country, and later others, to back him and his immoral ideologies. To criticize Hitler at this point was to publicly denounce a god to some people. By making a satirical movie, Charlie Chaplin was able to put forth his critique from a relatively safe distance, while also sending a message that would reach nearly all of the world. Jojo Rabbit deals with similar subject matter, but from a different time period. By now, it's a common held notion that the Nazis were bad and did terrible things. This could easily be said without the use of a rhetorical tool and still be well received. What Jojo Rabbit critiques is the politics and propaganda spread today and how damning it can be to the impressionable youth. By putting the film in the point of view of a young German boy who could be like any young American boy, just trying to fit in and find a place in the world, Waititi is able to provide a necessary critique of the haunting similarities between today and Nazi Germany. Without satire, the message of these films wouldn't be able to be as well received or as widely received, nor would they have been quite as effective.
Will return to the people, and so long as men die, liberty will never perish.